Okay, in this lesson, we're going to be taking a brief look at what are called reflexive verbs. This is a new concept that we're going to be seeing in Chapter 7. If you've looked up your vocabulary as you were requested to do at the end of our last test, you'll see that a lot of verbs in this section have something special about them that we haven't seen before. In this lesson, we're going to be taking a brief overview of how we use reflexive verbs in Spanish, what reflexive verbs are, and how we conjugate them. So let's go ahead and take a look. All right, first of all, reflexive verbs are called reflexive verbs because they describe actions that someone does to himself or herself. Think of things in your daily routine. For example, you get yourself out of bed every morning. Usually, you dress yourself, you bathe yourself, you brush your own teeth, you comb your own hair. All of these things, because you do them to yourself, they're called reflexive verbs. Think of a reflection. When you look at a reflection, who do you see? Yourself. So these are called reflexive verbs because the actions are actually reflected back on the subject. The one who's doing the action is also the one who's receiving the action as well. So, like a reflection, a reflexive verb is something that you do to yourself. All right? Reflexive verbs are really easy to spot. Take a look at your vocabulary list. All right, the reflexive pronoun say is going to be attached to the infinitive. Here's a section from your vocabulary list right here. Take a look at some of these verbs I've indicated with the arrows. We've got the verb acostarse, to go to bed, literally to put oneself to bed. Bañarse, to bathe. When you take a bath, who are you bathing? Yourself. Notice that se is attached to the end. We've got the verb entrenarse, to work out. Literally, this means to train yourself. Entrenar is a cognate. Now notice again, it's the verb entrenar. You just have a se attached. Bañar has a se attached. Acostar has a se attached. Acostarse, bañarse, entrenarse. These are all AR verbs, but when we attach that se, that makes it reflexive. That means you're doing it to yourself. Look at the last word on this list, maquillarse. Most of the time when we put on makeup, we're putting on makeup on ourselves. Maquillarse. Again, put makeup on yourself. Take a look down this list. See what other reflexive verbs you can spot. What other verbs in this list are reflexive verbs? All right, if you said afeitarse is one, you're correct. Despertarse, estirarse, lavarse, and levantarse. All of those that have that se attached to them are reflexive verbs, so they're all going to work like the verbs we're getting ready to look at. So all of these verbs are reflexive verbs. Why? Because you're doing them to yourself. The subject is doing them to himself or herself. And how do you spot a reflexive verb? Has the se attached. Now let's look how to conjugate these verbs. All right? There's really just a couple of steps that you have to remember in addition to everything that you've learned before. Excuse me. There are AR verbs that are stem changing. There are ER verbs that are, there are AR verbs that are reflexive. There are ER verbs that are reflexive, and there are IR verbs that are also reflexive. There's also stem changing verbs that are reflexive. So basically everything you've learned about verbs to this point and how to form them, how to conjugate them, they still apply. Think of when it's reflexive, it's just a little something extra you have to remember. When you conjugate a reflexive verb, the first thing you have to do is take off the se. Let's take a look at an example. The verb bañarse means to take a bath, literally to bathe oneself. How do we know it's reflexive? It has that se attached. First thing you do is you take off the se, and what's left? We have the verb bañar. Bañar is a regular AR verb. So how do we conjugate that? Take off the se. Then you conjugate the verb as you normally would, but you have to put a correct reflexive pronoun before the verb. Now, what are these reflexive pronouns I keep talking about? Take a look here in the red. We've got, if you want to say, I bathe myself, you say, yo me baño. Notice I put that word me in there. What I did was I took the se off of bañarse and I put it in front, but I have to change it to make it match up with the subject. Yo me baño literally means I bathe myself. That me means myself. You have to have it there when it's a reflexive verb. Me baño Literally, I bathe me. I bathe myself. You want to say you bathe yourself? Te bañas. You bathe yourself. Te bañas. Where did I put it? Where did I put that te? I put it before the conjugated verb, just like I did with direct object pronouns that we learned in the last chapter. You want to say he bathes himself? Se baña. She bathes herself? Se baña. You bathe yourself formal? Se baña. Me, te, se. Me baño, te bañas, se baña. That se again means himself or herself. Nosotros nos bañamos. We bathe ourselves. That nos means ourselves. Nos bañamos. If you want to say they bathe themselves or you all bathe yourselves, se bañan. Se. So notice again, it's se again so here se can mean himself, se can mean herself, se can mean themselves or yourselves depending on the context. But think of it as these two words are both part of the conjugation. Me baño, te bañas, se baña, nos bañamos, se bañan. Me, te, se, nos, and se. Those are your reflexive pronouns. But look, bañarse is a regular AR verb otherwise. O, as, a, amos, on. Those are the AR verb endings you've always had. What you have to remember, though, is you have to put that me in front. So basically, again, there's two steps. You take off the se, and then you conjugate the verb as you normally would, if there were no reflexive conditions there. But then you put the correct reflexive pronoun, that me, te, se, nos, and se, where? Before the conjugated verb. Now then, as I said, we have AR verbs that are reflexive, ER verbs, and IR verbs. You still have to keep track of what kind of verb it is and put the right endings on there. Also, some verbs can be reflexive and stem changing. So the stem changing verbs that we've talked about before can also be reflexive. One example is the verb vestirse, to get dressed. Literally, I dress myself. How do we know this is a reflexive verb? If you answered it's because there's a se attached, you're correct. Remember that se signals to you that's a reflexive verb. All right? How do we conjugate it? First off, we take off the se. And if you look at this conjugation, again, you have the pronouns in front, me, te, se, nos, and se, just like we did with bañarse. This is an IR verb. Notice it has IR endings, o, s, a, imos, n. But this is also stem change, and E changes to an I in this case. So if you want to say I get dressed, you say me visto. Say it, me visto. Tú te vistes. Te vistes. Notice again, two words. You dress yourself. Se viste. He gets dressed, or she gets dressed. Nos vestimos. We dress ourselves. We get dressed. Se visten. They get dressed. It's just conjugated like a regular IR verb, except for it's a stem changing verb, so that E changes to an I, except for in which form? Good, the nosotros form is regular, as you see, just like we learned for stem changing verbs in the past. And you have to put that me, te, se, nos, and se in front to indicate that we're doing the action, the person's doing the action to himself or herself. You have to have those pronouns, that me, te, se, nos, and se. Those reflexive pronouns have to be there. All right. Now I want you to try this a little bit. Let's take a look at the verb afeitarse, to shave, literally to shave oneself. Is it reflexive? Yeah, it has that se attached. So what we've learned so far, take off the se, and what are the pronouns that you're going to put in front of these words? Okay, for any reflexive verb, these are your pronouns. Me, te, se, nos, and se. Me afeto, te afetas, se afeta, nos afetamos, se afetan. Again, it's a regular AR verb. It's conjugated like a regular AR verb, except for it has that reflexive pronoun in front, showing we're doing it to ourselves. All right, let's take the verb ponerse. We learned the verb poner previously this year. Poner means to put. It's an ER verb. Like I said, sometimes verbs can also be, regular verbs that we've learned so far can also be reflexive verbs. Ponerse is to put something on oneself. What do you normally put on yourself? Well, clothing. For example, if you want to say, I put on my shoes, you're actually going to say, I put the shoes on myself. And you're going to use this verb ponerse. Now then, as we said, there's two words involved. What I want you to do is I want you to conjugate real quick the verb ponerse in the present tense. What's the first step? And then what do we do with that? Okay. So if you want to say I put on, me pongo. Remember the yo form of poner is irregular. But again, it's just like we've conjugated poner in the past. Pongo, pones, pone, ponemos, ponen. But you have to put that reflexive pronoun. You took the se off. Me pongo, te pones, se pone, nos ponemos, se ponen. I put on, you put on, he puts on, we put on, they put on. Okay? So if you want to say I put on my shoes, how do you say that? Me pongo los zapatos. You have to put that me. Alright? So, in order for you to get a little practice, I want you to take these four verbs. I want you to take the verb lavarse, to wash oneself. Remember the steps to conjugating it. Irse, we've had the verb ir before. It means to go. When it's reflexive, it literally means to go away. Sentarse means to sit down. It's an AR verb, but notice it's also a stem changing verb. That E changes to an IE. I want you to conjugate the verb sentarse. Remember, all of these reflexive verbs have two words there. The conjugated verb plus the pronoun in front, the reflexive pronoun. Dormir means to sleep. When you make it reflexive, dormirse, it means to fall asleep. Dormirse stem changes from O to UE, if you recall. So tell me how to say I fall asleep, you fall asleep, he falls asleep, we fall asleep, and they fall asleep.